Welcome to the video. In this video we're going to be looking at the tips, tricks and considerations when you're going to be flying remote control in the winter months. Now for those of you in the southern hemisphere this isn't going to be relevant, but for up here in the northern hemisphere the nights are drawing in and the mornings and evenings are getting a lot colder too. There's a couple of things that we need to think about when we fly in this colder, wetter weather, and we're going to cover that in this video. Before we get into the detail, I'd like to say a very big thank you to radioc.co.uk for sponsoring the episode. radioc.co.uk specialise in 250 class quadcopters and they stock all of the pieces, spares, radios, LIPO batteries, FPV equipment, and they also provide repair services too. So if you're here in the UK or on the continent and you want to deal with people that specialise in 250 class racing quads and also want local shipping, then radioc.co.uk is a great place to go and have a look. So the first thing we'll talk about is obviously the elements. The weather is going to be different. There's going to be lots of extra moisture in the air, but particularly on the grass. So every time you land, the downwash of your little quadcopter is going to wash moisture into all the nooks and crannies on your machine. Now, if you're flying multiple flights over a day, that kind of moisture can build up and potentially cause you a little bit of problem. Make sure when you get home that you are thoroughly drying the model. Use paper towels to get rid of any excess moisture and make sure the model is sat in a nice dry place so that any moisture that has managed to get under any heat shrink can be drawn out and taken away before it causes any problems. You will splash mud and grit into the copter as well. You won't land in, it's always going to be dry. The way these things work is that a quadcopter is like a puddle seeking machine, and when it comes down it will always come down in the one puddle in the entire field. That's just the way it works. When it does, it'll not only splash water but also splash grit into all the bits and pieces too. So make sure that if you do crash or you come down hard and there is mud on the machine, don't run it immediately because that will just pull all of that grit into the bearings in the motors. Spend a bit of time with a soft brush, just get cleaning off as much as you possibly can. Be careful not to push that grit any deeper into the crevices in the model, particularly things like the bearings, which are obvious, but also things like the barometers, which are on some of the more sophisticated flight controllers. They have a couple of holes and you don't really want anything getting in there apart from air. Good idea to always cover those with a piece of foam, but occasionally that foam might get knocked out. So if it has got knocked out, don't brush towards the barometer. Make sure that you're getting all of that grit and rubbish away. Last thing, of course, is store the models in a warm, dry place. It's very tempting just to stick them all in the garage, and unfortunately the garage might not be completely dry unless you are lucky and you have a heated one, and that potentially can mean that moisture can get in any wooden components and it's not fantastic. But do always make sure that you remove the batteries if you are going to store the models out of sight. Next thing to think about is the actual batteries themselves. Be aware, the LIPO batteries are just like every other battery technology that's out there right now. They rely on a chemical reaction to create the voltage and current that we use to fly. That chemical reaction changes depending on how warm it is. The warmer it is, typically the more efficient that chemical reaction is. So as we fly in colder weather, the LIPO batteries are not as potent, so the flight times will be shorter. I'd always recommend that if you have a timer set on your transmitter so that you know when your battery is going to be flat, reduce it by 15-20% just to give you a nice buffer so that you can fly around and then you can come and land and you'll still have lots of oomph left in the battery and you won't discharge them too much. If you're not going to be flying with your LIPO packs and you're going to put them away while you're putting that model away because you're not going to fly it in the darker, colder months, make sure that you are putting it at what's called a storage charge. Storage charge is typically about 3.8 volts per cell. Most decent LIPO chargers will have the ability to press a button and to only charge it to what's called storage charge. Once it's there, that's a great way to store it. Never store a LIPO battery fully charged. That will do it no good at all. And actually when you take it out in spring ready to start flying again, you'll probably find that one or two will have actually puffed up and have given up the ghost and you'll have to throw them away. And slightly humorous one at the end, LIPO batteries do come in handy as hand warmers. When you take them off the craft, they're generally slightly warm, and when you're trying to get the feeling back in your fingers, it's great just to kind of hold one in your hand. Next thing we'll talk about is tips and tricks for line of sight flying. This is where you're stood on the field with the radio control in your hands and you're actually looking at the model with your own eyes and flying it around. I'd absolutely recommend adding LEDs to the model for orientation support. In the darker light, it can be difficult to get the same cues from the model as which way it's pointing, and as any of you that's been flying for a couple of months will know, orientation is everything with things like quadcopters. So put some LEDs on there and that will really help. Be aware of the lower cloud cover. Now 400 feet is about the maximum you should be flying at anyway, but you'll be amazed at how quickly those clouds can come down and occasionally you'll kind of fly into them. I've had a couple of instances where I've been going up and I thought the cloud was a little bit higher than it was and my quad has started to disappear, so I've had to drop it out of that very low cloud. Also, be prepared to land the model quickly because the weather can change fast. It might look like it's okay and then suddenly it starts to turn a little bit more oppressive and before you know it, it's going to have a wintry rainstorm. Be aware that that might happen at any time. Just keep your eyes open. As soon as something that you don't like the look of is happening, make sure that your model is coming into land, that you're packing it away and you're back in the car before whatever it is starts to happen. Final thought here on line of sight flying, this is also relevant for FPV, but the denser, colder air will make the model perform differently. There is more air because of the denseness for the props to bite into, so the performance will be slightly different. So be prepared for that when you fly. FPV flying is probably one of the main ones that's affected by the winter months, over the top of things like LIPO performance being different. Definitely, I would still add LEDs to the model for orientation support. They are really useful for the spotter that's with you, so if you have a problem with the FPV equipment, then they have a rough idea which way the craft is pointing to give you a chance to bring it back up. Be aware that cameras and goggles do steam up. My very first FPV flight in cold weather, I managed to crash my quadcopter, and that was because my goggles actually steamed up. Don't keep your goggles in the boot of the car when you're travelling to where it is you're going to fly. Keep them in the car with you in the warm air, because if they're cold at all, then they'll actually condense the moisture of your eyes onto the lenses and you'll be in big trouble. Similarly, keep the model in the car as well. That camera lens will attract a lot of moisture. It's going to be flying forward through that moisture in the air and it will just collect and ultimately stop you seeing what's going on. I would consider using an LED ground station. I have my Black Pearl ground station, which is fantastic, and in the winter months it's a far better way to FPV because you don't have the problems with the haze from the sun blowing out the screen, and not only can you see what's going on, but the other people around you can kind of watch the flight, which is fun too. Do consider that the lower sun in the sky can cause some cameras to struggle with exposure. So some cheaper cameras will blow the image out and you'll lose all of the detail in the ground and it will try and expose for that bright sun. So normally in the summer the sun will be above your camera, so it'll be shining down on everything, it'll look fantastic. It's very easy to swing your craft round in winter and be looking directly at the sun and it'll expose for that bright sky and you'll lose everything else. Just be aware of that and be prepared to flick your machine around out of the way of the sun and to let it just settle down. Last thing we'll talk about then for winter tips and tricks is to obviously talk about you, the pilot. You will be standing still for longer than you think, particularly if you're new to the hobby. The amount of concentration that you're putting into flying and flight times of between 8 to 15 minutes will mean that you are stood stock still in a field that's probably near to freezing. You will get cold. Wrap up with more layers than you think you're going to use, because if you're not moving around you're going to get cold very quickly and it'll affect the way that you fly. Your fingers will get stiff. Have gloves with you and pop them on your hands when you're not flying. Fingerless gloves can be useful just to keep the blood circulating around, and because your fingers are not getting all the blood and your hands are getting cold, you will find that some of the tricks and maneuvers that you can pull off in the summer months will be a little bit harder in winter just because your fingers won't move as fast. Last thing to consider then is that some pilots will have shorter concentration spans. When some people get cold, they really struggle to kind of keep their mind on the task. Some people are affected more than others. If you're one of those people that does feel the cold a little bit, just be aware of that and just have a go and just see how long that you can keep flying in the colder weather before you start to get uncomfortable and your concentration starts to slip. So hopefully those are useful tips that will kind of give you something to think about as you go into flying in the winter. The great thing about winter flying is you can see some beautiful views, particularly if you're flying FPV. You can see the frost covered fields, you'll see snow covered landscapes, and you won't also have a lot of the other people who tend to be in the areas where you might fly walking dogs and doing those other things as well. So you'll have more of these open spaces to yourself, but think about what you're doing, remember some of these tips and tricks, and you'll have a fantastic winter's flying. Thanks again to radioc.co.uk for sponsoring this episode. Please go and have a look at their website and let them know you heard about them from us. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and happy flying.